Well, welcome back to another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast, the podcast that talks about what informs our faith and how our faith forms us. I am your host, Travis Jamieson. I'm a pastor at Palo Alto Christian Reformed Church, and I am joined today by Paul Taylor. Paul Taylor was formerly the pastor of Peninsula Bible Church here in Palo Alto for many years, and has recently made a transition and is now working for another organization called, TBC, but I'm blanking on what it's actually called. Paul, help me out.
That's okay. Transforming the Bay with Christ.
Yes,
That's our name.
Transforming the Bay with Christ. There it is.
Yes.
And Transforming the Bay with Christ helps pastors and churches all over the Bay Area to connect with one another and work together for the mission of Christ. It's an amazing ministry that has helped countless pastors, including my wife and I, as we came to Palo Alto a few years ago, and were immediately welcomed into these pastoral groups where we meet for lunch and prayer and connection. And that has been a lifeline for us as we do ministry here. As we'll talk about today in our conversation, in Silicon Valley, Christianity is by no means the majority. In fact, it's a small minority, and a lot of people don't have connections with churches or with their faith. And so, but perhaps that might be changing. We might see some changes, and that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yes.
So Paul, thanks for being on the show today. Really appreciate it.
Of course. Yeah. It's fun to be here.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to this conversation.
So tell us about a little bit about yourself. How long have you been in the Bay Area, and what has been your journey?
Yeah, I came out here in 95 from Houston, Texas, and I came out here to go to school and just immediately fell in love with the Bay Area. Never wanted to leave. Started attending PBC, the church where I served for a long time, my second week as a freshman in college, and had been logged about 30 years as part of that church. I was an engineer in college, and then I worked in software for a number of years. I went to seminary, and I started as a pastor at Peninsula Bible Church in 2007, and then just left in June of this year, 2025. So almost 19 years, and just a great season of serving as a pastor. I loved it. I love Palo Alto. I love the Bay Area, and we'll talk a lot about why and different reasons. I'm married. I've got 5 adult children, legally adult anyway. 4 of them in college, and 1 of them graduated from college. And my wife is also a pastor. So she became a pastor several years ago and is pursuing, finished her master's at seminary, pursuing her doctorate. And yeah, we're actually both doctoral students. I'm pursuing my doctorate in faith and work at Fuller Seminary. So those are the highlights. That's me.
Yeah.
That's the whole thing.
That's an amazing. And I know you're not going to go into this, but you won't talk too much about this, but I will say I think every pastor in Palo Alto knows Paul Taylor, and you're always such a huge encouragement to pastors. So we're all grateful for you.
Oh, thanks. I hear that.
And it's awesome that your wife is a pastor as well, and it's just fantastic to hear. So you said you're doing your doctorate on faith and work, and you also co-founded an organization with that same theme of faith and work. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. The kind of medium length story is that pretty much as soon as I became a pastor in the Bay Area, and even before, I mean, one of the reasons I love the Bay Area is just because of the excitement and the energy, the industry that happens here. There's a sense here that what we do really does affect the world, and that's pretty true. I did some research a few years ago and looked at the 10 largest tech companies at the time in the US, and 7 of them were headquartered within 10 miles of my church and probably your church as well. And so the kind of cultural impact that is centered in this location is so remarkable. And I really enjoy that. I enjoy the sense that people are doing things that have lasting impact and affect the world. But then as a pastor, I think I really felt a burden to try to help people understand what their faith in Christ had to do with the kinds of decisions they were making at work, the kinds of companies they were working for, the kinds of companies they were starting, the kinds of products they were designing and releasing. And I just, for a long time, felt like I didn't have a lot of great answers. I
Mm,
remember one time I used to do young adult ministry and sitting with a young man who worked at Google Maps, and he was fixing bugs, and he said, what does being a Christian have to do with this? And I'm sure I said something, but I don't think I really had much to say
mm,
because I it just was hard to kind of figure that out. So that led to maybe 6 or 7 years ago, starting to do some thinking and a little bit of writing on the intersection of technology with theology. And that was kind of where I started and started a little blog and podcast and started thinking about that. And then probably 4 or 5 years ago, I took over a program at our church that was kind of an in-depth lay training program, a 1 to 2 year, fairly academic training program. And it was really focused on ministry skills. So reading the Bible, studying the Bible, teaching, counseling, those kinds of things.
mm,
And when I took it over, I wanted to add a track that, from my perspective, gave the same type of theological background and depth, but for people that were in the workplace. So I started doing research on that, realized that there's a lot of people that have spent a lot of time thinking about that topic, and that they call that faith and work. That's kind of the neighborhood of people that are thinking about that topic. And so when I wanted to launch that program, that's when I began my doctorate and started learning a ton of stuff from Luther to Calvin to Dutch theologians to contemporary theologians, and conversations with you. I know you've got a deep background in some of those thoughts as well.
mm,
And then when we launched the program, it was really transformative for me as a pastor. The opportunity to give people a space to theologically reflect on their work life. And, I always told them, like, I don't have to tell you to integrate your faith and work. You're doing it. You have the Spirit. You're a follower of Jesus. Like, but let's talk about how and let's grow in that. And so everybody prays at work if you're a Christian. Like, your boss upsets you and you pray, or you have some
mm,
decision. Like, people are doing this, but it's not as much. There's not as many spaces where people can interact on that level. And so to have a room full of people, then that was really what we were doing, is what is Christ doing in us and through us at work? And I felt like the way I describe it as a pastor is I felt like I found a room in my house that I never knew existed.
mm.
I walked into this room and I'm like, oh, there's all these great furnishings in here, and there's all this is a beautiful room. And I just got to hear people's stories in a different way than I had heard before as a pastor. And so that got me really excited, really opened up a lot of new thoughts for me. And then it was only 6 or 8 months later that I decided to co-found the Bay Area Center for Faith Work and Tech. I had gotten to know my co-founder, Denise, because she was really active in the faith and work community in the Bay Area. She had a similar program that she was running out of San Francisco. And so I got to know her, and we shared kind of our similar interests, and then decided, hey, let's link arms and try to do something that'll serve the whole Bay Area. So that was about 2.5 years ago now, March of 2023, that we decided to do that. Spent a bunch of time preparing and planning, and then really officially launched about a year ago in fall of 2024.
That's great.
Yeah.
It's got to be unique focusing on faith and work in the Bay Area because of the way that the Bay Area attracts certain kinds of workers. Like it's not like at least like especially here in Palo Alto, I think
Yeah.
like so many of my neighbors are engineers, like
Yep.
software engineers, hardware engineers, or so many of my neighbors are doctors. Like it's very specific. And I think my wife and I were talking about this one time. Like, my daughter goes to our local neighborhood school, and of all of her friends, which she has a lot of friends, every single one of them had a doctor as a parent.
Wow, that's
Ev-
amazing.
Every single one of them. And so it's a very specific, like, it's like not your usual, I think of the small town I grew up in where, every parent is doing something different. There's a lot
Yeah.
of like sameness. Like we have such a diverse place as far as ethnicities go and backgrounds, but when it comes to work, we're actually fairly more kind of monocultural, I guess, in
Yeah, I
some
think you're
ways.
right.
So, like how has that been as you've engaged this topic of faith and work?
Yeah, the way I describe the dynamic you're talking about is if you think about two dimensions, I think the Bay Area scores as high as anywhere in the world on these two dimensions. And the first is how important is work to people's lives? And, people here, they love to work. And
Mhm.
I think the kind of percentage of their life that's wrapped up in their work is as high as it is anywhere in the world. There's probably places that are comparable, but I don't think there's anywhere where it's more. Um, and I always say, you know, when I was a pastor, when I meet somebody new on the church patio on a Sunday morning, and I say, "Oh, like, why did you move to the Bay Area?" There's only one answer.
Mhm.
It is work. Maybe school if they're young, but that's just part of the same category. There's only one reason to move here. And so the kind of place in people's life that work occupies is huge here. And then if you take the other dimension of the importance of the work that happens to the world, to culture, to how things are changing, the Bay Area, I think there's an argument to be made that it is the most influential place in the world today. People in New York might argue, they would say that
Mhm.
finance is more important. People in DC might say that politics is more important. People in LA might say that entertainment is a big cultural factor, and those things are all true. But I think there's an argument to be made that technology is changing the world's culture faster than any of those other things. And so you put those two things together, like a place in the world where work is so important to people, and a place in the world where work is so important to the world. And yeah, like talking about faith and work here is just critical. Like, and as Christians, if we can't get our minds around that, and if we can't help people to do that, particularly as pastors, then I don't know, I think we're really abrogating one of our responsibilities, like to help people know how they're sent into this world and how Christ goes with them and what that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like we have to be fully present where we are and live
Yeah.
with the realities of where we are. And here in Silicon Valley, we live with this reality that work means almost everything to people.
Yep.
And yeah, as pastors, as Christians, Jesus calls us to, hey, you're going to be doing your incarnational ministry right here, and you're going to engage all these people, and you are those people.
That's right. Yeah. You're one of
I
them.
think the Bay Area also attracts pastors that like to work all the time, that like to invest a lot of time and energy into
That's fair. Yeah.
it not and I don't mean that like as a negative thing. I mean like it's I know that that's my personality is that I just absolutely love this work and I love putting
Yep.
lots of energy and time into it. And so I need to learn how to engage my work, even as a pastor, in a Christ-like way and fully integrated with my actual what I believe spiritually and what the Bible says, just as much as my people do. And so this is really good work you're doing. So
Yeah.
recently um, you co-authored a Christianity Today article with your co-founder, Denise Yon, and the title is The Silicon Valley Revival Has Momentum. Next comes maturity. So I want
Yes.
to spend the bulk of our time today discussing this article because I think it's really important and brings up a lot of important points. So the first thing I want to just ask is, what is the Silicon Valley revival that you're talking about that has momentum?
Yeah. That's a reference. And I will say with all respect to CT's editors, we didn't necessarily use the word revival in our version. And I think revival can be a loaded term. And so,
Hmm.
um, for a lot of reasons, one, it can mean different things to different people. And also, frankly, like revival implies that there was something there to revive. And I think
Mm,
revival really only happens in a Christian culture because you're reviving faith. But in the Bay Area, I think it's something else. It's a new work of God because most people here don't have a faith to revive in the first place. That
mhm,
being said, it's a word that people like, and it's a word that immediately clicks. And so, what we're referring to is a couple different things. There's been a few events that have gained some national attention over the last few months. There's been some other articles in Vanity Fair, in the New York Times, and other publications regarding this organization, Acts 17. Michelle Stevens, who's a good friend of ours and a partner organization of ours, and they're doing great work really on kind of an evangelistic front of saying, how do we get people interested in Jesus? And so they've had many events, a couple of events with Peter Thiel, who's a well-known technologist and a professing Christian. And so they've gained some national attention for large events that they've held. And that, from my perspective, is part of a larger trend that I see in the Bay Area where people are just more open than they used to be.
mm,
COVID, I think, reset people's opinions in a lot of ways. They reset people's patterns. And so I know at my church, we were seeing more people come to us that didn't have a faith background and that had legitimate questions. And so I think people are exploring in a way that they haven't been in the past. And whether it's a revival or not, is not necessarily mine to classify. But that's the trend. I'd say it's kind of a general movement that I've noticed, and I think other pastors have noticed around openness, and then some of this national attention around events that Act 17 has been putting together.
yeah, you mentioned in the article that in Silicon Valley you find both post-Christian disillusionment and pre-Christian openness.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a great way to put it because I've found the same thing. And
Mm.
yeah, but what do you mean by those two terms?
Yeah, I mean, the post-Christian disillusionment, that's really a reaction to something. And so post-Christian is not just post in a chronological sense, but it's really in a reactive sense. And so there's a lot of people in the US and in the West in general, and I know you know this, you've studied this, but that have reacted against kind of historic Christendom.
Mhm.
And they either have disillusionment, there's sometimes anger, there's a lot of kind of, I was taught this, but now I believe that. And so that is certainly true in the Bay Area. There's a lot of people like that. Um, but the relatively new thing, I think, is kind of a pre-Christian attitude where people whose parents didn't teach them faith, they didn't grow up going to church, they don't have anything to react against. And so from their perspective, it's kind of a wider open market
Mhm.
of thought and belief. And there's less of that reaction to something that didn't serve me well and more of a kind of what's out there and what could be true. And I think that that is, shown in ways that people are um, interested in coming to church, interested in talking about spiritual things. I think there's still, even among kind of the pre-Christian thing, there's still a little bit of a latent suspicion of religion and religious institutions, but there's an openness to spirituality that frankly I find really exciting. That's why I've always loved the Bay Area. I think that conversations here can be had with a lot more openness than they can in some parts of the country where there's certain expectations or cultural assumptions about what people believe. But here it's just kind of like anything goes. And that's really fun to me.
Yeah, I totally resonate with that. I want some of the stories I tell to people about ministering in the Bay Area is when I got to the Bay Area, it was the first time in any place I've lived that when I tell someone I'm a pastor, I get responded to with the question, what does a pastor do?
Yeah.
Which in no other place I've lived, and I've lived in a couple different areas in the Midwest, no one would have ever asked me that because they would have in the zeitgeist, they know what a pastor does.
Yep.
But I've been asked that honestly, like, oh, what does I don't know what a pastor does. Or a question like one fellow I was talking to, he just asked me, he's like, so I don't I don't know why you would basically become a pastor. What led you to be a pastor?
Yeah.
And those kind of questions really excite me because I'm like, you get to just it's just an open door to actually talk about what
And
the
it's
church is
legitimate
about.
curiosity.
Yes.
It's not like, oh, that's stupid. Why would you do that? It's like,
Mhm.
oh, tell me more. It's curious to people.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like, oh, you're an oddity. Like that's a new thing.
Yeah.
Like I don't hear that very often.
I had a conversation with somebody I was just telling this story recently. Somebody at a block party. This is probably 10 years ago. And she asked me what I did, and I said I was a pastor. And I think before she could catch herself, she blurted out, "Do people still do that?" I was like, "Yeah, there are some of us who still do
Yeah.
that." But it was not aggressive or hostile. It was just like you say, I was an oddity. Like, oh,
Yeah.
if I'd said if I were a knight, she would have said the same thing. Or
Yeah, exactly. Like, oh.
like, do people still do that?
Yeah, absolutely. It is funny like hearing people's reaction. When I first moved into the area, I was meeting one of my neighbors who lives like a block away, but we were down and saying hi. And when he asked what we did, he said, "Oh, are you guys like lawyers or doctors or like
Uh-huh.
what?" That was the question. And then I was like, "No, actually, we're pastors." And he said, his response was, "Is there a church around here?"
Huh.
And what's funny is I live within walking distance to my church, and he lives closer than I do.
Well,
So it
whereas,
shows kind of like how it's like just not always on people's minds.
yeah.
But then we have another neighbor who's just like, is more of the pre-Christian, who's just like, and she asks lots of questions and is curious about church and, because it's a whole new world for her. So,
Yeah,
um,
that's well said.
yeah. So you, um, you talk about in the article though, like there's this kind of growing, or at least it's talked about in, yeah, like New York Times, Atlantic have been writing articles about this openness to Christianity in the Silicon Valley. But you say it's like we definitely need to respond with excitement, but also discernment
Mhm.
in what's being reported. And why do you have that both? Like why both excitement and discernment?
Yeah, I mean, I think for sure excitement because the history of kind of religious movements across time have often started with flashpoint events or something big happens and there's a lot of cultural enthusiasm, there's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of openness, and so that's a lot of times how God works. If you think even back to like the day of Pentecost, I mean, there's like one big event and there's something dramatic, and that's a great thing. But then on the heels of that, what God often does, and I think what the community then is responsible to do, is to kind of steward that momentum and steward that excitement. And following Jesus is not always an exciting thing. It's not always something that the crowds get excited about or that maintains. And so there is a sense of discipleship, a sense of, Eugene Peterson's a long obedience in the same direction. And so that's really our heart. And I think that's most people's hearts that are followers, is that this kind of excitement would mature into really deep um, discipleship that takes seriously, that following Jesus is involves sacrifice and it involves being countercultural. And there's just a whole lot of growth that happens through pain and challenge and
Mhm.
God showing up in surprising ways. And so, really, that was the heart of our article, to say this is a great thing and let's continue it into the next stage of deepening and maturity.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned that the phrase faithful influence. is
Yeah.
is one of the kind of visions you and Denise both have for Christian workers in the Bay Area. That I think I have the quote here. It says, "The goal is not merely survival in a secular workplace, but faithful influence." And it reminds me of that. There's that book called Faithful Presence by David Fitch, right? Where it's
Yeah.
a similar idea, where it's sense like it's not that against culture, it's not fleeing from culture, but instead it's remaining faithful amid what you're involved in. And yeah, how does that look like? How are you seeing that lived out? Like when you have conversations with people in the Bay Area and you're thinking about how do we move people to a more mature faith, more grounded faith? Um, how are you seeing that, like that faithful influence play its part?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, one of our flagship programs for faith work and tech is an 8-month deep dive discipleship that unfolds over 24 different sessions with video and in person. And, essentially it's 8 months of an answer to that question of
Mm,
what does it really look like? Recognizing that, we are being formed always by all the influences in our life, whether it's church, whether it's social media, whether it's our workplaces, our families, our neighborhoods, our schools, we're always being formed.
mhm,
And so if we're going to really understand what it looks like to be intentional about integrating our faith in Christ into our workplace, it's not it involves some reforming as well, that you kind of have to unlearn some things and then relearn some things. And so that's really, being a faithful influence. There's just a lot of layers to it. But I'll just kind of spend a second unpacking each word. Faithful, I think, is the recognition that there's a relationship with Christ. There's a relationship with Christ that grounds our identity, that grounds our practice. And so there's something about kind of who we are as a person, and our spiritual growth. And what we find is that a lot of people, we use the word disintegration to describe their experience, that they've compartmentalized their faith and their work. And so when they go to work, they're really not showing up as entirely themselves. They're disintegrated. And so we talk a lot about integration, which is related to integrity and is related to faithfulness and it's related to reshaping our patterns and our habits and even our thoughts so that wherever we go, we are guided by Christ and we are aware of his presence and we're not kind of just putting those things in different categories. And, sometimes that involves sacrifice, sometimes it involves showing up in ways that might be costly or might be countercultural. That's kind of the faithful part is it's really about personal growth and what does that look like to reintegrate those parts of our lives. And then the influence is how does that play out in the places that we find ourselves. And so we're really focused on the workplace, but the same is true whether it's school or family or neighborhood. But how do we show up where God has sent us and be his representatives?
yeah.
And I really like the word influence because everybody has influence. And
Mm,
one of the things we do as part of our program is we have people create what we call an influence map that maps out the kinds of influence they have. And everybody finishes that exercise and says, wow, I had no idea the kinds and levels of influence that I have. And I think back to that conversation with the young man who worked at Google Maps and I think that's what, part of what we want to do is really open people's eyes to what they're really doing. And his question of, I'm fixing bugs at Google Maps, what does that have to do with my faith? And I think what I would say today is like, well, you're doing so much more than fixing bugs
mhm,
on Google Maps. Like you're in a physical space with other people. You're part of a team. You're aware of team dynamics. You have coworkers, you have managers, maybe you have people that report to you. You're part of an industry, you know, but we get kind of this like laser focused vision on I'm doing this thing And I don't have any authority. All I'm doing is fixing bugs that somebody else created. But if he were to go through that exercise and say, what kinds of influence do I have? I think he'd be shocked. And the question is, how do I use that influence? How does Christ want me to use that influence? How do I show up as a follower of Jesus? And sometimes we use the word agents of redemption. How do I become an agent of redemption wherever I find myself? And maybe it's as simple as, there's a person on my team that nobody ever listens to and everybody finds annoying, and so they're sidelined. And how can I just elevate them in a meeting?
Mhm.
How can I say, hey, what do you think? Because nobody cares what they think, but maybe they do have some good thoughts. Or, how can I change the way we're designing a product so that it serves people in a better way or avoids hurting people? And so there's these little ways of how can I be an agent of redemption wherever I find myself. And that's really exciting. I think it gives people a new energy for work as well, because it's a new challenge, and it's not easy, which is why we think it takes a while to figure this stuff out. It's not, you don't just read a book or listen to a sermon and everything clicks. It's
Mhm.
about learning it with a community and growing together in it.
Yeah, the way I would phrase what you're summarize what you're saying is like a repersonalization of work. Like
Yeah.
this refocus on the relationships. Like influence means relationships. You
Uh-huh.
you don't really influence things as much as you influence when you talk about influence, you're influencing people. And I think that's a really helpful framework for thinking about work, is that bringing us back to and it doesn't matter what job you do. You could be a software engineer, you could be a pastor, you could
Yeah.
be a garbage truck driver. Whatever you do, you can get so hyper focused on the depersonalized aspects of it.
Hmm.
Like for me, as a pastor, I could get so focused on preparing a sermon
Right.
that I disregard or I neglect the people I'm called to serve.
Yep.
Even though the sermon's a part of it, like that's
Yep.
part of the service. It's not the whole of it. And I think this is a really important factor as Christians, that we recapture this relational. Um, one thing I would also add perhaps is, you know, Charles Taylor in his book, The Secular Age, always talks about the how we live in a society that has been disenchanted. Like we
Yeah.
have no sense of like the transcendent in our
Mhm.
world. But as Christians, we bring that transcendent, that enchanted worldview into our work with us. So it's not just that we are um, seeing the people around us, but we're seeing them for who they are, that they are image bearers,
Yep.
they are children, they have been created for a life with God. And I mean, that's huge when you're like,
Yeah.
oh, this is what I'm called to. Like, this is what I can be involved in. And then it's like, it's not that you may be working on something really technical, not that that's not important. That's super important, that's very important. But it's like, but also,
Yeah.
these people around you and these image bearers are so critical.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would expand that a little bit. I think the relationships, most people don't think about their relationships at work as, yeah, opportunities for God to work. So it absolutely starts with individuals and starts with people, but there are a few other levels, because there's systems in our workplaces, and there's dynamics, and there's things that get kind of embedded into the way that things work,
Mhm.
which ultimately affect the people. But it's kind of a level of abstraction above that. And that's something that sometimes Christians aren't really dialed into, the fact that they actually have influence over some of those systems,
Mhm.
because many of them are informal, many of them are not written down in a handbook, but it's just how we treat, how the teams treat each other, or how power gets shared, or those kinds of things. And then there are the products, that we are creating, and that's a level where your job function does determine a lot of the, like, how much influence you have over different things. But there are people in our congregations that have tremendous influence over products and product direction and industries even. And so we also believe, what if those decisions were made in a prayerful way? And what if those
Mm.
decisions were made taking into account the fact that people are image bearers and taking into account what it really means to be human from a biblical perspective, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
We have kind of a picture of like concentric circles that we use to talk about kind of like people and systems and products and industries, and it just kind of ripples out. And that can be overwhelming for people, but it's also it's exciting because
Yeah, absolutely.
God uses you in different levels in different ways.
And that kind of segues into something I did want to ask about in with Michelle Stevens and the work of Acts 17. She says we were always taught, and just so the listeners know, like Act 17 focuses on these events that are seeking to influence like the top of the top elite Silicon Valley. It's like Peter Thiel. I mean, there's probably very few people in the world have more power than Peter Thiel.
That's right.
And so she's, through her work trying to influence them. And she says, we were always taught as Christians to serve the meek, the lowly, and the marginalized. I think we've realized that, if anything, the rich, the wealthy, the powerful need Jesus just as much. And when I read that statement, there's something about that that creates some tension in my heart.
Mhm.
And I don't have final thoughts on it, but I'd love to hear yours. It's like, what do you make of a statement like that? Why does that need to be said? Is there critique that can be made there? What are your thoughts on that statement?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably a both and. I think that there are plenty of organizations and efforts where you recognize that there are thought leaders and there are cultural leaders that shape things in a significant way. And so, um, you know, I think it's a question of like understanding influence and understanding what the different levels are. And so I remember early on, this may be a long-winded way to answer, but early on I got exposed to the work of International Justice Mission.
Mhm.
And I remember that they used this image of so many relief organizations are pulling people out of rivers because they're drowning. And they said, what we feel like our call is really to do is to walk upriver and stop the guy who's throwing them in the river
Mm.
and stop the perpetrators of injustice, not just rescue victims. And um, that kind of comes to me as maybe part of what Michelle is saying here is it's not, people are drowning in rivers. Like we need to save them. Absolutely. Save the people drowning in rivers. But
Mm.
there are some systemic things we can do, and there are some people who have outsized influence. And if we could go upstream and affect some of them and engage them with the gospel, then absolutely we should. I'm part of everybody's concerned about AI. Everybody's talking about AI.
Oh,
There's,
sure.
so many of these groups that are trying to think about AI from a Christian perspective. And so I'm in a few of them, and we were talking with one of them, and one of the technologists was saying there's probably, I forget the number, but it's like 8 people in the world that are really making decisions about the future of AI. And it's the names you would suspect, but it's the leaders of these huge AI organizations. And
Mhm.
if you're an engineer in an AI company, you don't have influence to shape the future of AI. You do have lots of influence in various ways, but should we be strategic about trying to engage those 8 people? And should we try to do so in a way that benefits human flourishing and protects people from some of the dangers? Yeah, absolutely. And I,
Mhm.
and I think Michelle feels like that's part of her unique calling. And so I would say, great. Like we need people that see that as their unique calling. And I don't think it diminishes at all the people that are pulling folks from the river downstream. I think what she's alluding to is like maybe maybe we've been taught that that's all we should do is kind of save victims,
Mhm.
and I think she's just saying, hey, let's do it all.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, one thing it got me thinking about, and you mentioned this earlier, that different areas of the world or let's just stay with the country. With the country, have different centers. So like we are the tech center, LA is the entertainment center, DC's the political center, New York's finance center. Um,
And
nowadays,
Texas is the barbecue center. You can't, I mean, I
yeah,
am a big fan of
which
barbecue.
I am too. I actually now I want to go to Texas. But but no, but like you think about that and you think about these different centers, like in our world, how do we as Christians think about influence without it becoming something warped? Like
Yeah,
in the sense of like in DC, I'm sure there's all kinds of churches and ministries that are like, how do we influence politicians for good,
yep,
or for Jesus even? And but then you also have the Doug Wilsons of the country who are like, actually, we need to actually take this country back for Jesus and make it a
right.
Christian nation. Um, and when I hear some of this conversation about influencing the elites of Silicon Valley, I worry that maybe it's a similar thing. That if we could just get the most powerful people to follow Jesus, then we will have a good world. And yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts if that's come up at all, and whether, how do we keep this? And maybe it's like your term, the exilic discipleship is kind of
Yeah,
is a way forward for that. But like maybe you could just talk a little bit. How do we avoid some of the ditches on the side of the road here?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a great question, and I think it's really the question for all of us, and I think it's a question for individuals. I go back to maybe it's that faithful influence, that faithful part of it. And yeah, I mean, history is littered with stories of people that were like, I want to gain more power so that I can do more good. And then
Mhm.
they get more power and they don't do good. So absolutely. And so if our target is, we're going to try to work with the people that have the most power to do the most good, there's a lot of landmines in that
Mhm.
strategy for sure. But there's a lot of landmines in any strategy for the gospel. And so recognizing what those landmines are, and that power can be addictive, and power can deform us in ways.
Mhm.
And so I do think that the idea of exilic discipleship is really key there, because it can acknowledge that idea that if we have influence, we ought to be stewards of our influence. And so if we have tremendous influence over the future of AI, we should be stewards of that. And if we have relationships with people who have tremendous influence over the future of AI, we should be stewards of that relational network. And so I think that's what Michelle and others are trying to do, is to steward their networks really well. Um, and part of that stewarding is, as people get to know Christ and follow him more deeply, then they're being made aware of those ditches on either side, and there's that call towards faithfulness, and call to say, I think what I love about the exilic discipleship framework is that it's recognizing that we are in a place that ultimately is not the kingdom. We are not in the kingdom of God. And Daniel is kind of the example par excellence of an exilic disciple in my book, where he was second in command to an evil empire.
Mhm.
And presumably he made that evil empire thrive, or he would have been executed. You didn't get fired in those days. Like,
Yeah, right.
the fact that he
There was no
lived,
getting laid off.
no, there's no getting laid off. You did your job really well, or you were killed. And so presumably he did his job really well. And yet he found a way to be faithful to God in the midst of that, and to
Mhm.
maintain his identity. And so I think that's the kind of thing that we should call everybody to, whether you have tremendous influence or little influence, or more local or national or international.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, I think your caution and your sense of like worry is fair, and um, certainly one could have a motive of reaching rich people because you want to share in their wealth. And I mean,
Yeah.
I that's and you could have a motive of reaching poor people because you want to look like a saint. So, it's
Yeah.
just everything we do is littered with questions about our motives.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think Daniel is um, such a great example of, I think, what you're going after because he's it's so obvious, like with the story of Daniel, that it wasn't just about like what he was doing. It was ultimately about God working in that situation. And so
Yeah.
like he had the courage to be that faithful influence by actually praying when he wasn't supposed to be praying, um,
Hmm.
and following God when he wasn't supposed to follow God, according to the people around him. And he did that out of that sense of faithfulness, not out of that sense of like power grab. And
Yep.
then God, in God's plan, he was using Daniel in a very specific way. And yeah, it also reminds me of the story of Joseph as well.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
that Joseph was in his own exile
Yeah.
of sorts. And he was faithful first, and God had something in mind for him. And that famous phrase, "What you meant for evil, God meant for good," I think is something that takes a real Christian imagination to keep in mind, like a really biblically soaked imagination that somehow I might be involved in something that someone may be doing something terrible or evil to me, or my work may not be working out quite in the way I thought it was going to. Um, but like God has a bigger plan in all of this, and He's
Yeah.
using all of us in certain ways. And so that call to faithfulness, I think, is just so critical that like as we go to work, as we raise our families, as we worship at church, it's like that faithfulness is always our greatest call.
And it's the faithfulness to the kingdom of God, to God and his kingdom. And I think
Yeah.
that's the danger that you're calling out is if we think that we're going to influence the rich and powerful and the kingdom of this world is going to be uh, fixed by their power and influence, that's not the way it works.
Yeah.
It's always the kingdom of God.
Right.
But if we can influence people with wealth and power that can work, can acknowledge the kingdom of God and submit themselves to that and recognize that that's ultimately what God is at work in the world, then sure, like let's reach everybody.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, Paul, thank you so much again for having this conversation with me. This was really fun, and I'm just so
Yeah.
grateful for your good work. And tell Denise thanks as well,
Yep.
because both of you were in that writing that article and the work you're doing in the Bay. So, yeah, thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Appreciate your work and your friendship and you just as a friend and thought partner. So thanks, Travis.
You're welcome. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, like and subscribe and pass it on to a friend. We want more people to know about these great conversations.